Hello, this is the Dreadweaver. Prepare yourself for a night of true horror stories that will weave webs of terror in the darkest corners of your mind. If you're a fan of stories of mystery, true crime, paranormal, or anything that crawls in the shadows just beyond our sight, you've found the right place. Tonight, I have 6 listener-submitted stories of times when mysterious entities have entered our earthly realm. Following these stories, we discuss a mysterious event that occurred at one of America's most notorious haunted houses. If you like what you hear, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications. All of these actions tell YouTube you want to hear more from us. And with that, let us delve into the darkness. Story 1. Am I my own shadow person? Does anyone have any thoughts on shadow people being living people from a different timeline? Possibly even yourself? Or am I crazy for thinking this? Here's my story of my shadow person throughout my life so far. I'm interested to hear if anyone has any similar experiences or thoughts on shadow people. I never thought much about the shadow person from my childhood, chalking it up to an overactive imagination, or maybe just a trick of the light. At least that's what I believed, until the day it reappeared. As a child, this shadow figure would silently stand in the doorway of the spare bedroom, watching me as I lay in bed, staring back through my open bedroom door. It would only come at night, never moving or making a sound, just watching. But somehow it never felt threatening. For years, I slept with my door open, and every night it would be there, a quiet presence. Eventually, I grew older and began closing my door, making sure it could no longer watch me. By the time I was a teenager, I had convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination. Yet, even as I outgrew my childhood fears, I still found myself closing the door to the spare room every night, as though some lingering part of me remained cautious. I never saw the shadow person again during those years. Then, in my early 20s, I came back home from uni for Christmas. Staying in my old bedroom like I often did, I awoke one night to find both my bedroom and the spare room doors wide open. And there it was again, standing in the same spot, watching me, just as it had all those years ago. I stared at it, waiting for my eyes to adjust, for it to dissolve in the shadows, but it didn't. It stood there, clearly defined arms, legs, a head, but no face. I was an adult now, too old to believe in ghosts. But how could I explain this figure that had haunted my childhood, now appearing once more, just as vivid? Too frightened to get closer, I eventually crept out of bed, shut my door, and stayed awake the rest of the night. The next day, I investigated with my family, determined to find a rational explanation. We looked for anything that could cast a human-shaped shadow in the doorway. But the light source from the street had changed since I was a child, as all the street lights in the UK were updated in this time, and there was nothing that could explain the shadow appearing now, let alone during my childhood. We waited until nightfall to see if the shadow would reappear and I could find a rational explanation, but it never did. Years later, I stayed at my family home again, this time with my partner. We slept in the spare room, the very room that had always frightened me. At first, I felt uneasy, but with my partner by my side, I pushed the fear aside. But after he left early for work, I found myself alone in the house for a week. One night, while walking to the bathroom, I noticed that the door to my childhood bedroom was open. I had left it that way after clearing out some old things. I paused, staring into the room where I had spent so many nights in fear. Something strange washed over me, a shift in energy I couldn't quite explain. I stood there, frozen, as memories of my younger self staring back into the spare room flooded my mind. That's when it hit me. I was standing in the exact spot where the shadow person used to stand, looking into the same place it once had. Could it be that I had been staring at myself all along? Was I the shadow person, looking back through time at my own childhood? The thought was chilling, yet oddly comforting. All those years of fear, and perhaps I had been haunting myself. Story 2. The Vampire Man by Frequent Analyst 370. When I was 5 years old, my family lived in an apartment that had once served as a resting place for travelers in the late 1800s and early 1900s. The building had an old, lingering presence, and it wasn't uncommon for my mother to share unsettling stories. She once told my brother and I that during a barbecue party in the garden, she had seen strange faces peering through the bedroom windows. My brother refused to use the bathroom at night, claiming he heard strange noises and saw shadows moving in the dim light beneath his bedroom door. One night, something happened to me that I will never forget. I woke up suddenly, startled by the sound of a man's voice calling out, "Hello? Hello?" over and over. The voice was unfamiliar, and as I opened my eyes, I saw him, standing right above me, bent over, staring straight into my eyes. The sight of him froze me in terror. He looked like Nosferatu, but without the exaggerated ears. Bald, gaunt, and impossibly old. But the most horrifying detail was that he wasn't standing on the ground. He was floating. He drifted backward, hovering toward the entrance of my bedroom, and in a soft but urgent whisper, he beckoned, "Follow me! Come! Come!" Against all reason, I found myself getting out of bed and following him. He led me across the small hall and into my parents' bedroom, which was right next to mine. I stood frozen in their doorway as the figure floated silently toward their bed. He extended a long arm, pointing directly at their sleeping heads, and in a hoarse voice he commanded, "Look! Look!" That's when the terror took over. I let out a scream, louder than I thought possible, and broke into uncontrollable sobs. The fear I felt was unlike anything I had ever known, raw, primal, shaking me to the core. My parents jolted awake, startled by my cries. The moment they stirred, the figure vanished without a trace. Through my tears and panicked breaths, I could only yell, "The vampire! The vampire was here!" This was no dream. I've revisited that night countless times, and the vividness of the memory, along with other strange experiences in that house, has always confirmed to me that what I saw was real. Story 3. Something Came Into My Room by wukedypuk. When I, 38 and male, was 18, I lived in a suburb of southeast Melbourne, Australia, Noble Park. Our house was the odd one out. On a street of 70s and 80s brick homes, ours was an Alpine-style weatherboard home with a steep roof built in the early 20th century. It was old, cold, and noisy, and you could see the ground through the gaps in the floorboards. We had a big dog who stayed outside until everyone was home, and then slept outside in a big pen doghouse at night, mostly in the summer. We also had an indoor cat. The week it happened, I was home alone. Dad was overseas, Mom and Sis were visiting family. One night, I was walking home from work. I rounded the corner and noticed a figure standing on our carport roof, looking through a window into one of 3 upstairs bedrooms. The sun was setting, so all I could see was a dark silhouette. I yelled at it from the top of the driveway, and it was gone. I remember thinking it odd that my dog didn't bark or notice anything. I went inside, checked the house, the dog, the windows and doors, etc., and everything seemed in place. I assumed I had just seen a shadow from a nearby tree at sunset. The following night, I walked home from work and everything seemed normal. I checked all windows and doors, let the dog inside for the evening, and eventually put him and myself to bed. My bedroom was upstairs, down the hall from the room next to the carport roof. Before bed, I had a routine of shutting all doors in the house, as they were all squeaky, and the drafts would often blow them closed if left open. This night, I closed all doors, checked locks, turned off all the lights, and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I was awoken by something. Not sure what, but when I came to, focused my eyes and looked around, I saw the hallway light coming in under my door. I thought I turned it off, but perhaps I forgot. Right then, my doorknob started rattling, like someone was struggling to open the door. I immediately lay back down on my side, facing the wall opposite my bed, and my heart started beating hard. I heard the door open and closed my eyes. I figured if someone was breaking in, I'd pretend to be asleep and maybe they'd take what they want and leave. I slowly opened one eye, the one against the pillow so it was less obvious. I saw the light from the hallway on my wall. My bedroom door was fully open. My heart was beating harder. I laid still. I saw the digital clock on my CD player, and it was a little after 2 a.m. Then I heard the door creak again, and watched as the light on the wall slowly started to disappear. The bedroom door closed. At this point, I was positive we were being robbed, but I continued to pretend I was asleep. Keeping one eye open, everything is heightened. The loudest noise was my heartbeat, but I tried to listen through it and couldn't hear anything. No breathing, no footsteps, nothing. At this point, I began to feel pressure around both my feet. The blanket got tighter around them, and I realized that something was now sitting on the end of my bed. I looked at the clock again, and it was now a little before 3 a.m. I was frozen, scared, and had no idea what was happening. At some point, I had the idea to slowly readjust my position in bed and move my feet a little to see if something moved or happened. So I did this, but as I slowly readjusted my feet, I felt one of them hit something solid. Something was definitely sitting on the end of my bed. I didn't know what to do at this point, so I stayed still and listened, while looking through one eye at the clock in the bedroom wall. The next thing I remember is hearing the first bird start to chirp before sunrise. I looked at the clock and it was now a little before 6 a.m., and I noticed the room was a little brighter. The sun was coming in. Shortly after this, I felt the pressure lift from the end of the bed. I heard the bedroom door open again. I saw the light from the hallway on the wall again, and then the door shut and the sun started to rise. I got up shortly after this and checked the whole house. All doors and windows were locked. The dog had slept through the night, and nothing from the house was missing. My cat was stuck in the bathroom overnight. He must have followed me in when I brushed my teeth without my noticing. I'm not sure what happened, but I won't forget that night in Noble Park. Story 4. What Spoke to Me from My Parents' Room by Commercial Ad 2042. This happened a few years back when I was a sophomore in high school, probably 2017. My family and I had just moved to a new place and were renting a house. On the day this happened, my parents were out of the house running errands, leaving my brother and I at home. We were both upstairs in our rooms, right across the hall from each other. While in my room, I heard the garage open. I thought my parents had come up, so I went down the stairs to check the garage. Nothing. I went back upstairs, back into my room, and began to hear dishes move in the kitchen. Again, I walked out of my room, looked over the stairs and into the kitchen to see if my parents were home. Nothing. I walked back into my room after this, and a few minutes later heard a voice in the house. I walked to my bedroom door, opened the door, and saw my brother standing right in front of me. He was also coming out of his own room. We both told each other that we had heard our parents and began walking down the stairs. Halfway down, we were having a conversation, more than likely arguing about something kiddish, when my mom's voice called my name. For context, at the bottom of the stairs was the door to my parents' room. They had left the door to their room open with the lights off. It was pitch black. My brother and I instantly went quiet and looked into the room while remaining on the stairs. A few seconds passed, and we heard my mom's voice again, only this time it said my brother's name. Not a moment later, my brother and I bolted up the stairs and locked ourselves in my room. I instantly called my mom and told her that someone was in the house. Luckily, she and my dad were at the grocery store, just 5 minutes away. This is the first and hopefully only time that something like this has ever happened to me. My first thought was not that it was something paranormal. The voice was so clear and human-like and matched my mom's voice that I really believed it was her, or an actual person. Of course, it wasn't. She wasn't home, and neither was my dad. Looking back on it, I never really liked that room. It was way too dark and unsettling. So I still wonder, what spoke to my brother and I from my parents' room? Story 5. Attics Are the Worst by Unlikely Film 955. I've had quite a few different paranormal experiences in my life. This one left me more shaken than most. I was in my mid-20s and staying a few nights with my best friend at the time, C, in the house she rented with her boyfriend, B. B's parents owned the house, so their rent was cheap, but they'd often take on tasks to help maintain and renovate the home. They were in the middle of one such project, and had been regularly accessing the attic to work on in-ceiling electrical connections or some such. Because they were frequently in and out, they had moved the ceiling panel that served as the door of the attic and simply left it open until the job was complete. This took a couple of weeks. The opening was in the ceiling of the guest bedroom, and lucky me, guess where I was sleeping? Sleeping in that room with the attic open was unsettling, and I had to lay with my head covered and my back to the hole in the ceiling. But this creepy incident actually took place in the middle of the day. C and I were standing in the room as B was describing the project they were doing, when I felt compelled to look up into the hole above my head. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary attic. In the natural light, I could see a couple of work supplies and beams of the roof, but nothing abnormal. However, as if I was seeing a second layer of reality in the same place at the same time, there was movement. The best way I can describe it is as if I was seeing something in my mind's eye, even as my physical eyes saw only wood and insulation. In this second layer of vision, a black, amorphous blob was lingering at the edge of the opening, and I had the sensation of being watched, even though there was nothing discernibly alive about it at first. Nevertheless, it felt awake, conscious. I couldn't wrap my mind around this visible but invisible form, so I kept staring at it, trying in vain to form some level of comprehension. Suddenly, it moved, flowing around from the right side of the opening to the left before developing into the shape of a head and shoulders peering down over the edge. The face had no features. It was still just opaque, inky blackness, but I could tell it was looking at us, even sensing when the head seemed to turn toward me, and it realized I could perceive it as well. Getting chills and feeling quite uncomfortable now, I forced myself to look away and tune back into the words coming out of B's mouth. I convinced myself that tropes about creepy attics were running away with my imagination, and pushed it from my mind. Until the next day, C and I were in her car when she suddenly got kind of quiet and serious. She said, "There's something I've been wanting to ask you, but I wanted to wait until we weren't in the house to bring this up. How do you feel about that attic being open in your room?" "It's a little creepy, and I don't like facing it when I'm trying to sleep, but it's fine, I guess," I replied. She hesitated, but then asked, "I saw you looking up there for a while yesterday. Did you see or feel anything?" Being asked this directly, I told her what I had seen, but not seen, what I had imagined in my mind's eye. All the color drained out of her face, and her voice was quiet when she finally responded, "You're really freaking me out. I've seen the exact same thing there, in the exact same way. It was black and kind of fluid, moved sort of like an amoeba or something, until it peeked out and looked down at me. I even saw it the way you described, like it was in my mind's eye and not my normal physical vision." Feeling sick to my stomach at this point, I told her I thought it had to be my imagination. Too many scary stories and movies in my life that focused on attics and got into my psyche. She said she had told herself the exact same thing, but she couldn't believe it anymore. Not after I had described to her the exact same energy, entity, creature. We couldn't decide what to call it, but neither could we deny that it was there, and in some way had exposed itself to both of us, possibly without even meaning to. She got a little stern after that, telling me she did not want to mention or acknowledge it while inside the house. Didn't want us to give it any more energy where it could possibly hear us discussing it. We dropped it after that, but falling asleep in the guest room later that night was significantly harder than it had been the night before, when I could no longer convince myself that there was nothing watching me from the attic. Story 6. The story of my haunted 55 Chevy. A few years ago, I bought a 1955 Chevy Bel Air, two-tone sky blue and white four-door. It had a high-nickel 350 small block, a Holley 600 carburetor, and a Hurst 4-speed transmission. As a car enthusiast, I was in love with it. Despite my girlfriend at the time, and even my mom calling it hideous, I had big plans for it. A fresh paint job, reupholstered seats, and new rims with white wall tires. When I first got the car, it had 28,000 miles on it. But as soon as it hit 28,587 miles, the odometer broke and stayed stuck on that number. About 10 days after I bought the car, strange things started happening. For instance, I'd come home with all the windows up, but by morning, one or all of the windows would be down. Then there was the night I heard a low rumble from the garage. When I checked, the car was idling, even though I knew I had turned it off earlier. Items like drinks, hats, and tools would disappear if I left them in the car overnight. One night, the horn blared uncontrollably, forcing me to disconnect it to get some peace. There was one incident where the hood fell on my hand. I ended up needing 7 stitches, but that might have been my fault. But other things felt more eerie. Like one time, I was sitting in the car with a buddy, and when I started it, the radio began playing a song that directly tied into our conversation. It was unsettling. My girlfriend at the time had a best friend who was a medium, and she was terrified of that car. She refused to go near it. She said the car radiated a dark energy, something she couldn't fully explain. Whenever she visited, I had to park the car facing the wall because my garage had no door, and she'd swear it felt like it was watching her whenever I parked it facing outward. The activity wasn't limited to the car either. After I got the Chevy, strange things started happening in my house too. Doors and cabinets would slam, I'd feel cold spots in heated rooms, and there were nights with knocking on the walls. Sometimes I'd even hear footsteps in the kitchen late at night. Eventually, a family friend who's also into classic cars and had owned several Tri-5 Chevys offered me $10,000 for the car. Since I'd only paid $8,000, I took the offer. That was in September 2021. After I sold the Bel Air, the paranormal activity in my house calmed down, although the house is over 100 years old and still haunted to some extent. But I can't shake the feeling that the car somehow amplified the hauntings. A few months ago, I was talking to the new owner. He had fully restored the Chevy, making it into the beauty I had always envisioned. He loves the car, but when I asked him if he noticed anything weird, he admitted that every now and then strange things happen. The strangest incident happened one morning while he was having coffee with his neighbor. His neighbor asked him what he was doing out late the previous night, saying he'd caught a glimpse of the Bel Air driving down the road and returning about an hour later. The new owner, though, swore he hadn't left the house that night, let alone driven the car. Story 7. A stabbing at the Villisca axe murder house. It was June 9th, 1912, in the small town of Villisca, Iowa. The family of Josiah and Sarah Moore were walking home from their local Presbyterian church after the Children's Day program, which Sarah had helped to organize. The family consisted of Josiah and Sarah and their 4 children: Herman, age 11, Catherine, age 10, Boyd, age 7, and Paul, age 5. The family walked along happily, enjoying the weather and celebrating the success of the day. Lena Stillinger, 12, and Ina Stillinger, 8, walked along with them. The girls were friends of Catherine and had been invited to stay the night at the Moores' home. The next morning, around 7 a.m., neighbors were alarmed when the Moore family had not been seen leaving the home to tend to their chores. When the neighbors were unable to make contact with the family, they contacted Josiah's brother Ross, who let himself into the home with a key. Upon entering the home, Ross discovered the bodies. Authorities were summoned and an investigation ensued. It was determined that sometime around midnight, while the family slept, an unknown assailant entered the family home with an axe and bludgeoned all 8 occupants as they slept. The axe was found to have been the family's own axe, likely taken from the backyard as the killer lurked around the property. While many suspects were investigated, over 100 years later, the killer still has not been identified. The horrific nature of the tragedy has sparked many rumors of hauntings over the last century. After its restoration in the 1990s, the house was registered as a historical home and opened for tours. Visitors to the house have reported all manner of hauntings, from disembodied footsteps, voices of children, and objects, especially toys, moving around on their own. It has been crowned one of the most haunted houses in America and has been visited by ghost hunters and TV programs from around the globe. It is these very stories that attracted Robert Stephen Lorson Jr. of Wisconsin and his friends to the house in November of 2014. On November 6th, Lorson and his friends arrived at the home for an overnight stay, planning to conduct a paranormal investigation. He sat alone in one of the home's bedrooms, his group of friends waiting for their part of the investigation outside. At 12:45 a.m., around the time the murders are thought to have occurred, Lorson used the group's 2-way radio system to call out to his friends for help. His friends found him in the bedroom with a stab wound to the chest. 911 was called, and Lorson was taken to the hospital for intensive care. Authorities determined the wound was self-inflicted. Lorson, thankfully, eventually recovered from his injuries. This is the first and only time such an incident has taken place at the Villisca house. So what caused Lorson to inflict such terrible injuries upon himself? Authorities have ruled out foul play and have declined to press charges. They say they were unable to find any kind of motive for the events that occurred. Owner Martha Lynn said, It's all walks of life that have an interest in that story. Sometimes it gets overpowering when you're in there at night. While some believe the ghost hunter pulled a publicity stunt in order to tell a good story, others believe that perhaps not all the spirits in the house want to play nice. It's unlikely we will ever know the truth about the situation, however, as Lorson refused to comment on the incident, reportedly out of respect for the family. What do you think happened in the house that night? Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Dreadweaver. I'll be back next week with more grisly tales. If you would like to submit a terrifying tale of your own, head to our subreddit r/thedreadweaver or send us an email at thedreadweaver@outlook.com. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the bell icon to turn on notifications if you want to hear more. Until our paths cross again in the shadows, stay vigilant and beware the whispers of the night. This is the Dreadweaver, signing off.